Hello, Croeso. Welcome to the Senedd Sources Podcast, where we take you inside Welsh politics. I'm Ollie Cole, and also with me on the podcast, Jo Kiernan, former advisor to First Ministers Rhodri Morgan and Carwyn Jones, before that a journalist, and now at Cavendish Consulting. Hello, Jo.
Hello, Ollie.
And with me also Craig Lawton, who is a political advisor and candidate for the Welsh Conservatives, now working at Grasshopper Communications. Hello there, Craig.
Hi, Ollie.
Right, plenty to get through. So on the podcast today, crunch time in Caerphilly, how Plaid Cymru conference changed the minds of members and voters, plus peace offerings and politicking over the Senedd budget. And of course, along the way, if you've got any thoughts, comments, questions, do send them in. We've got a WhatsApp number. We will read them out in the next episode and try to answer anything you are asking. We'll also use it when you come and join us for our live recordings in the future. That number 0333 404 6507, and start your message with the word Senedd. Or you can email us with your questions and comments as well. The email address is hello@seneddsources.com. So we start this podcast a week away from a by-election in Caerphilly. Quite a big one. On the morning of us recording this, we have had some new polling out as to what that by-election result might look like. It's from Survation, and it's for a public affairs company called Camlas. Now, two little bits of caveating to do. First of all, by-elections are always very hard to poll because there are not many people there, unlike a huge sort of general election or a whole Senedd election. And also, these responses have been picked up from people calling people up. And as we always know, it's a lot easier to get someone to answer a question on the phone than it is to get them to the ballot box on the day. But what it shows, Reform 42%, Plaid Cymru 38%, Labour 12%, the Conservatives on 4%, the Greens on 3%, and the Lib Dems on 1%. So going into this, Jo, I mean, Plaid Cymru were talking this up as a two-horse race, so were Reform. It seems like that might be borne out.
Depends on turnout, though, and with all those caveats you just gave to the poll, I don't think we can take this as read. And I wonder whether it might change the minds of some of those people who are planning to vote for some of the other progressive parties. There's been a lot of discontent, for example, that the Greens chose to stand in this election, how the votes are splitting on the left. So I think it'll concentrate minds. I mean, everything that we're hearing from the ground suggests this poll is right. I think Plaid Cymru are still optimistic and working it hard, but I think there's a kind of inevitability. They'll be utterly delighted if they manage to pull it off, but they won't be surprised if Reform do. And interestingly, Plaid Cymru had their conference last weekend. We'll come on to that, but no surprise that Nigel Farage pitched up in the constituency on the first day of their conference. And interestingly, I don't think everything is going their way necessarily. It's funny, isn't it? As opposition parties, and Plaid are learning this to some extent at their cost as well. But you've actually got to have policies. You've got to have something to say. You can't keep saying the same thing over and over. And Nigel Farage, in the interviews that he did at the tail end of last week, was pressed harder than I've seen him have to go through before on when are they going to have their candidates, when are they going to have their policies. Most of what they're talking about in the Caerphilly by-election, at least half of it, I would say, are sort of non-devolved issues, even though it's for the Senedd. So, you know, when is there going to be some more meat on the bones? Whether really that makes any difference next Thursday, I'm not convinced.
And Craig, they're sort of in a strange position in this because usually, you know, the narrative goes that Reform are the party that you vote for if you're protesting against the status quo, right? But actually, in the Caerphilly by-election, the two parties out in front, you know, could be seen as a protest party from, you know, current Labour voters and stuff like that. So they're trying to really pressure now the two sides of that voting base, aren't they?
Yeah, and I'd say it's an interesting one for Plaid Cymru in particular, though, because they're kind of looking at both sides of the coin here. They are kind of seen as the government in waiting in Wales, and so they need to put out a progressive, thoughtful agenda for what they're going to do over the next 4 years post-election. But at the same time, they, as you say, need to maintain that narrative of we're the only party that can stop reform. If you voted for someone else before and you want to see positive things happening, you need to lend us your vote, for want of a better phrase. So they're trying to kind of do this bit of a tightrope act, whereas Reform don't have to really worry about that at this stage. They can just, bulldoze through the middle and use whatever measures they want to try and get some support from anywhere. And the positive thing for Reform, I guess, is that their vote isn't coming from any one particular place. They're getting votes from former Conservative supporters. If they were just looking for that in Caerphilly, they wouldn't be doing very well. So they're clearly getting support from other places as well. Anyone who's disaffected in politics in general, but anyone who's never voted before. But as Jo has said, turnout is going to be key as well. I think this data is really interesting because you could argue that, to paraphrase, for Wales see Caerphilly at the moment, it's pretty much a replica of what we're seeing, with the top end being stretched even more. And some of the Labour activists I've been speaking with a couple of weeks ago were actually saying to me that the data they're getting from Labour on the doorstep and about what they're seeing on the doorstep was replicating what the polls were saying. So it feels like, actually, while this might feel like a big piece of news today, this has actually been a pretty steady situation over the last month or so in Caerphilly.
Yeah, and I saw one Labour source, Joe, say, we knock on more doors than this poll has necessarily, every day of the week. And so they've already had that baked into their campaigns for some time, haven't they?
I mean, Labour are in a really tough position, aren't they? Not only have they got an unpopular Welsh Government, an unpopular UK Government, an unpopular local authority who are having to make cuts because budgets are so tight. It's kind of a perfect storm. But what I'm hearing too is Labour have a formidable machine, activists who go out doing sort of like the hard sort of walking and knocking on doors. They're still doing that. And what people are telling them is that they really don't want to see Reform win this by-election. I mean, it goes back to my point earlier. I'm sure Welsh Labour wouldn't advocate this, but will some of those people think I need to cast my vote differently just because we don't want to allow Reform in? And I just want to bring into the conversation a TV hustings that we had last night, a week ahead of polling. And almost it's difficult to know what to say about it because it was the most bad-tempered, bickering, shouty, just generally unpleasant panel of white, middle-aged men. And I just, watching it, I'm not sure much light was shed on what the candidates feel. It certainly didn't replicate, I don't think, particularly the concerns of the population of the Caerphilly constituency. But I think it did highlight just how divisive this campaign has been. So most of it just went in one ear and out of the other because it truly was quite unedifying for me. And as I say, I think 50% of the population, i.e. women, would have been turned off by it. But the one bit that really did resonate for me was a mother in the audience who said that the father of her two sons was part of the 2% of residents in Caerphilly who were born outside of the UK. She was directing this at Reform, but others on the hustings panel as well, saying that she's lived in Caerphilly her whole life and has never felt more afraid and unwelcome in her own community, to the extent that she's having to tell her sons not to go to certain places, be careful when they're out. And she just summed up for me just how divisive this campaign has been and just how long it's going to take to repair some of that damage.
Yeah, and look, I'll put on the record that I started watching the debate last night live. I work in politics. I shouldn't probably say this. I actually did turn it off. I thought, I can't watch this.
Shame on you, Craig. You need to be there for the long haul.
I thought I cannot watch this at 7 o'clock in the evening, and try to put myself in the mindset of a regular person who isn't into politics and doesn't think about this on a daily basis, turns the TV on to find out a little bit about what the parties are thinking and doing. is this what they expect from their politicians? And is this what they want to see? I don't think so. If I want to see people shouting at each other on TV at 7:00 in the evening, I'll put something like EastEnders on. I don't watch that either. But I just can't think of anything worse to watch on an evening. And I think it was a poor representation of politics in general, actually. I would be clear, I have gone back and watched it from a professional perspective. And what I thought was very interesting, though, is it was horrendous, as you said, Jo. You summed it up. It was awful. But what I think is interesting is I've seen some of the social media clips that the parties have been putting out since then. It looks like a different debate. They have been so carefully cropped and so carefully selected to work to their exact ends and to their message. I do question the value of TV debates now. I know we've not had them for all that long in this country. I do question the value of them, though.
I think there's a difference, though, isn't there, that for some reason these constituency by-election ones are different from the sort of Wales-wide where we've got the party leaders on. But yeah, didn't shed much light at all on proceedings.
I'd just like to make one more point on this one, though, and it's a point that you've just made there, Jo. I think what we do kind of forget is that actually these things are pretty tough. They are difficult. And I'm sure in your time when you worked with Carwyn Jones, you had a whole machine, including yourself, Jo, supporting him and preparing him. You had probably focus groups. You had discussions about, I don't know, what kind of tie he was going to wear, how he should respond to different people in different ways. We see that when it comes to the leaders' debates as well, UK-wide. These essentially are people, and this is not a criticism of them, these are people vying for a backbench position in the Senedd. Some of these people may never run for election again. Some of them may become MSs. I think we have to remember the context of who these people are and actually whether we should be having them if this is what we expect of people.
Yeah, and if I can just come back on that, I think it's a really good point. You could tell that some of the candidates there were nervous. They'd never had to do this, probably never done live telly.
Yeah.
Interview clips for news programmes is a very different beast. But there were a couple of people on there who ought to have known better. The bickering and the shouting, etc. And the one cardinal rule I had for both of the FMs that I worked for when prepping for these events was you don't shout and heckle your opponents. It's a really bad look. And actually the public don't like it. They can't hear what's going on. Enough said about that, I think.
It is one of those weird things because everyone goes in with the intention of, this is, a lot of people don't really engage with politics as purely as people like we do, until about this period out from a vote. And to sort of think that in that case, most people must have gone into that debate thinking, well, here's the chance to sort of move any waverers. And in the moment the actual thing started, that whole premise, that whole idea seemed to go out the window and say, okay, I'm just going to shout as loudly and hopefully I get more time on air that I can get some more social media clips out, which is sort of bizarre. Let's go from the TV to the actual what's happening on the ground, though, because there's been quite a lot of interesting developments in the campaign over the last couple of weeks. Llyr Powell used to work for Nathan Gill, who obviously pleaded guilty to taking bribes from Russians when he was in the European Parliament. He was the last Reform Wales leader, and that is something that I've seen circulating on social media quite heavily over the last couple of weeks, but also is turning up at the doorstep. People are starting to face that question now, and it's one that hasn't really been sort of gripped and addressed fully by the party. It's constantly been sort of skirted around and, well, let's move on to other things. And the other thing is this bit of Labour work on the ground who seem to have put up these vans around the place saying, we're going to save your local library. And it has been pointed out to them quite clearly that it's being closed, under a Labour council, under a Labour Welsh Government, and you're apparently the antidote to that as the Labour candidate, which doesn't quite compute in some people's heads. So it's been interesting the last couple of weeks of the campaign, Craig.
Yeah, and I mean, at one level it suggests that the parties feel that the public are tone deaf, and it sends a pretty poor message out to what the parties expect of the public. And the public and voters, they're no mugs. They will make their own minds up. And I always question generally, what value is there in vans driving around with any political messages on it? I think, they grab the attention of people like us when they're outside the Senedd and they're outside Westminster, but do they really have the desired effect more generally? I remember as a candidate, we'd have the occasional van turn up and we'd be told, not do you want the van, it's the van is coming, get people to turn up. And it was almost an opportunity to gather your supporters around the van for a photo op and to show that you had support and that you were doing something. How far it resonates with people, I don't really know. And as you say, that there's this kind of hypocrisy around closing libraries when it's a Labour local authority that is closing them. I think the Labour candidate did make a fair point in the hustings that, you know, not every Labour candidate has to do what the Labour Party says and does. But when you're on a national platform, there is an expectation that you are at least going to support the policies that your party is putting forward. So I thought it was an interesting one. And I feel a bit sorry, I'll be honest. I feel sorry for Richard Tunnicliffe, the Labour candidate, actually. And I mean this as a positive thing. I wonder whether he's just too nice a guy for politics. And that's not meant to be a criticism.
Well, I wonder how he would take it. But on the libraries, of course, there's been loads on social media about that hoarding site. I think the point that he and his campaign team are trying to make is that they want some of the new UK Pride in Place money to be used in the constituency to keep libraries open. Basically, part of that money funding stuff that the councils just aren't able to do at the moment. But just going back to the other point you made, Ollie, about reform and Russian money and treachery. Really interesting that I wondered when we spoke about it a week or two ago whether that would be a bit of a flash in the pan on the doorsteps, but they were refusing to do interviews. Farage has numerous times said that he barely knew Nathan Gill, patently untrue, because there are so many photos of them together over the years. He, because he was in Wales last Friday, he did various interviews, and when one of the journalists asked him about it, he got all outraged and how dare you, that's beneath you. Clear did something similar on Radio Wales yesterday morning, I think, where again he said, how dare you ask me this question, I've addressed this. And it's as if they think that they're above scrutiny, that they can dictate constantly what the media talk about, what people on the doorsteps want to ask about, interest. And it could be that, you know, by addressing it, they actually dilute the impact of that. They've taken a completely different stance. And I'm not sure it's working for them. It's still circulating massively on social media. There are certain media outlets too that are doing lots of digging. There are pictures of all sorts of members of the reform hierarchy now being pictured with Nathan Gill and his wife over various periods in time. So I'm not sure that telling porkies is going to bother them, but maybe it should bother them a little bit more.
Can I ask a quick question then, Jo? So in your time when you were working as a special advisor, what was your advice to First Ministers and other people in leadership positions? Was it own the debate, respond to it and hope it goes away? Or would it be actually by responding you're fueling this and actually you should ignore it and carry on doing what you're doing?
What is specifically in terms of the Russian stuff now?
Well, I mean, just in general with difficult questions that you don't want to answer, because every government and every party has things it doesn't want to talk about.
Yeah. I think it depends on what the issue is. There were some where you were just feeding the fire in a way, but I think you always had to say something initially. Whether you continue to give a rolling commentary is another matter. You can keep the story running on, but I think just trying to duck, refusing to do interviews, choosing one journalist who you think I can, give an answer to this particular person and no other outlets have the right, was how he was terming it, to interrogate me about this issue at all. I just think it's not a good look, and you're just storing up problems. They could perhaps have dealt with this more quickly and moved on to other stuff.
Can I just go back briefly as well to the point that was made about libraries again and UK government money Labour wanting UK government money to be spent in Caerphilly? I would genuinely ask the question, why do we need a by-election in order to make sure that UK government money comes to a constituency irrespective of which party is in charge, the public would look at that and say, well, if we deserve this money, we should be getting this money. And why has it not come already? Why does it take a by-election for this to be an issue?
Very easy to answer that one. One, it hasn't come already because the money hasn't actually been sent down from UK government. And of course, Caerphilly will get their share of it. I think because it has been such an issue on the doorstep, the Labour candidate has said, I would like some of that money when it comes down the road to be used to keep our libraries open.
It is interesting to your point, Jo, about that really interesting Farage interview where he said, that question is beneath you to a journalist, and I always
it's so patronising.
Yeah,
as well,
and I always
it?
I understand sometimes, and I sort of understand where Reform are coming from, which is they think their voter base is sick of the current media sphere and the current political sphere. And look, I'm a journalist. We are not popular people, but neither are politicians. And I think sometimes they forget that. Sometimes they forget the bit that actually the journalist is more likely to be seen as on the side of the public, asking the question that the public wants answered, rather than the sort of politician taking the huff and saying the public don't care about this. That's for the public to decide. So a very interesting by-election coming up. We will... we'll watch that one unbelievably closely. It could be a big shift in the electoral landscape, and that really, really important indicator of turnout will be the one to watch, definitely, as Jo was mentioning, because just one extra bit from that polling, which was fascinating, was the Labour vote from 21 to 25 is sort of split three ways, 26% one place, 31% another, 80% back to itself. But the real big difference is the 71% of others, people who would have voted for pretty much none of the major parties in 2021 going to Reform. So it's all about whether those people on the day, if it's pouring down with rain, windy, they've got a lot of stuff on, actually go and cast their ballots. There'll be a lot of work going on there. We're going to turn our attention to Plaid Cymru in just a moment, because they've been having their party conference and work out whether it's changed the minds of members and voters at all. Remember to subscribe on your podcast app, or you can watch us on YouTube. Search for Senedd Sources, where we upload full episodes for you to enjoy. WhatsApp us as you're listening with questions and comments, ideally using a voice note so we can play it out on next week's episode. The number 0333 404 6507, and start your message with the word Senedd. We'll be right back. Well, this is the Senedd Sources Podcast. Thanks for being with us today. I am Ollie. We've got Jo and Craig with us as per. And Craig, you headed off to Plaid Cymru conference last week, and you were looking out for, where the divisions were, where the sort of party messaging was going in and coming out of that. How do you think it went?
Yeah, like I said last week, I was looking for dissent and I was looking for policy. I think I got both, in fairness. So it was an interesting conference. I've said before that Plaid Cymru conferences in the past felt quite insular, quite inward-looking. It felt much more like they were very mindful of the fact that they were on the world stage, or at least the whole of Wales stage, when it comes to being scrutinised as the government in waiting. I thought there was a lot of positivity in the air. I thought Rhys Iorwerth's speech was, of all the leader speeches I've seen this autumn, was by far the most visionary, the most positive and the most upbeat. For a lot of the others, we've seen a lot of negativity about other parties. There was a little bit of that still, but it was much more positive about what he wants to see for Wales and the vision he wants. A little bit light on some policy, it's fair to say. We got a couple of headline policies around childcare, and it's obviously a significant increase in the and a change in the childcare policy for what we have at present. But actually, it's not that dissimilar to what's available in England at present. And I did a bit of a straw poll with some friends who are accessing similar support in England to just double check with them. And it looks pretty similar to what's available in England at present, but nonetheless, headline grabbing. Headline grabbing as well, not just for Plaid Cymru supporters, but actually for anybody in Wales that might benefit from this policy. And it sets a clear agenda out for the type of Wales that Plaid Cymru want to have. They want to support families. They want to look to the future. They want to look after our future generations. I thought it was a very interesting angle for them. However, there was a little bit of undercurrent still. And Plaid Cymru are in a little bit of a tricky spot still when it comes to a few policies, energy in particular. There was a protest outside from a group in Carmarthenshire that was concerned about energy infrastructure. There was a little bit of a protest, 30 or 40 people with placards outside. I did spot a former Conservative parliamentary candidate in there as well, though, which I thought was interesting. They are from Carmarthenshire, though, to be clear. And there was a fringe event as well, which took place discussing renewable energy, which resulted in some intimidation from an attendee, and ultimately they were removed from that event. But definitely some uncertainty there. And I think the Plaid Cymru Senedd group is kind of falling in the middle somewhat here, because they have for some considerable time talked about the importance of supporting the natural environment, supporting farmers, supporting their rural areas. But they've also talked about the importance of renewable energy, energy security, and achieving net zero. And it's quite hard for them to square that off fully. And there was a debate and a motion put forward for Plaid Cymru members to vote on, which talked about energy infrastructure and what the policy would be. And quite interestingly, this was actually moved up to their national convention. There was a counter motion or an amendment put forward by Plaid Cymru MSs to move this on somewhere else to really form a full policy going into the next election. I'm not surprised they've done that. What I was surprised at, though, is that there was unanimous support for that motion. There was not a single dissenting Plaid Cymru member attending that wanted to speak against this being moved on and debated in another forum. What this tells us is the prize of being in government is a massive one, and Plaid Cymru are, for the first time, potentially, from a grassroots level, really taking this seriously.
See, I've got a slightly different take about
is this going to be cynicism now, Jo?
Plaid conference. So we were talking about Nigel Farage and the Caerphilly candidate not liking scrutiny, and how it's just part and parcel of the political game, as it were. And I think Plaid learnt that to an extent this weekend too, because it's a completely different level of scrutiny now, of speeches, of policy intentions. And I noticed, the Plaid Cymru leader is an experienced broadcaster, very comfortable in front of the camera or in TV studios. But I noticed probably for the first time this weekend that various media opportunities that he and other senior colleagues did were much more scratchy. Journalists wanted to interrogate some of their policies. The details weren't always there. And, you mentioned that motion on energy, Craig. They didn't want bickering on the conference floor, so they sent it away, because there's this huge problem when you're preparing for government. And I think they're still unprepared, I guess what I'm trying to say to some extent, in that you're going to have to make really, really difficult decisions. They didn't want that played out on the conference floor, because inevitably, and I remember it from the 10 years that I worked in government, in order to do the right thing sometimes, and I'm thinking particularly on the energy agenda at the moment, you have to agree things and plough a way forward that actually is going to alienate some of your core members. And you have to have grown-up discussions. You have to convince them of why it's necessary. And that's going to happen time and time again, whether it's over grid infrastructure in Carmarthenshire, whether it's over water infrastructure in the future, whether it's about a new road and whether or not it should be built. And I think they're underestimating just how tricky being in government is in terms of those fraught decisions. I think the top team aren't necessarily in that headspace yet.
What I did think was positive, though, is that I actually did see energy developers coming together and having a not always agreeable, but a sensible, well-mannered discussion with the Plaid Cymru leadership. That is the very first step that is needed. And they're not going to find a solution to this if they all don't get round the table. And they are getting around the table, which I think is definitely something to be welcome.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have a special next week, aren't we, Ollie?
Yes, exactly. So if you love that policy area, if you're interested in energy and all of these tricky little things coming together, and what whoever is going to form the next Senedd is going to have to try and get over the line, that will be happening next week. And the other interesting part of the Plaid Cymru conference I found was actually independents coming back into the conversation a little bit. They sort of skirted around talking about it full throttle. There's been an interesting sort of putting it off until after their first term if they get into government. But, it was brought up in Westminster this week. It was Prime Minister's questions. It was brought up by Rhynab Iorwerth again over the weekend. And so they are sort of starting to invite to the fight now that they're used to having. And I think Labour are particularly G'd up to sort of try and start hammering them on it if they keep going in that direction, because at least they can get the book out of the shelf of the attack lines on independence, unlike necessarily on some other issues. I just want to touch on, before we finish, the wrangling over the Senedd budget. We were talking a few weeks back about how, there's a possibility that, staff at the Senedd weren't going to be able to get paid if this budget couldn't get over the line, and all the politics around that. This week, Jo, an olive branch of sorts.
Of sorts. Well, when we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, I did say that, unlike over the summer where everyone was saying, no, we're going to make Labour pay, we're going to make them suffer as part of our build-up to next May's election, I'd sensed a real softening of that. And I think that Mark Drakeford laid out his draft budget on Tuesday in the Senedd, £27 billion with 380 million left unallocated in the hope of being able to do deals on this. Now, Plaid Cymru, who had definitely been in the no deal camp earlier in the year, are still making noises. It's their budget, they need to get it through. But actually, behind that, you can see they are not willing to face the repercussions of not getting this budget through. And just to let people know, the issue is that if they can't pass the budget by the start of the financial year, the government is only allowed to allocate 75% of that 27 billion. And we've been told already by local government in Wales that would lead them to sending out redundancy notices to around 13,000 people. Now, any political party who wants to be knocking doors next March, April and early May saying that they voted down a budget and are partially responsible for people having redundancy notices land on their doormat is braver than I am. I think this has concentrated minds. But we also had, which just made me laugh really, and I'll be interested in Craig's response to this. We also had the Welsh Conservatives, who have never in the history of devolution done a budget deal with government. And, it wasn't a massive shopping list. It was only kind of a reduction in income tax. It was wanting to scrap stamp duty. We don't actually have stamp duty in Wales. It's called land transaction tax, but it's essentially the same thing. And what was the third thing, Craig? There was another on the shopping list.
I'll be honest with you, I can't remember the third one. And
I can remember
I think stamp duty is the one that's got all the attention.
Well,
sorry, go on.
Remember.
I'll go back to you first. Go on.
The third thing was business rates, abolishing business rates. So, a little package that adds up to about £1 billion if you were to do it all. They have honed it down just to stamp duty. But again, the finance minister's figures on the cost of that compared with the Conservatives' figures on the cost of that, a wider card.
I'll try and be brief on this one. So, I think it's not a bad move from the Conservatives, because it shines a light on the policy that they announced a few weeks ago around stamp duty in England, and it kind of gives it more legs. It also reinforces the criticism that they themselves made of Jane Dodds as the sole Lib Dem for essentially, in their words, not really holding out for an awful lot last time when it came to signing off a budget. It kind of demonstrates what they want. It's interesting, though, because the First Minister said she's more than happy to meet with Darren Millar and discuss this further, which I don't know if Darren was really expecting that. So I'm not quite sure how those discussions are going to be happening now.
He was absolutely chancing his arm. He was almost smirking in interviews that I saw him do. The First Minister and the Finance Minister have no choice but to sit down with whoever. Were I to bet on them being the people that a deal is done with for that 380 million quid? Not convinced.
What I would observe, though, here is that actually, by Labour saying they will have a chat, for want of a better term, with Darren Millar, what that's pretty much done is that's written the script for reform, which is all the parties are the same. It's reinforced the argument that they're actually all working together. They're not really doing what you want. We're the only ones as reform that are going to stand up for what they perceive as people wanting. And I would observe on the argument around redundancy notices going out and no party wanting to say that they've played a part in that, I disagree. I think that there is a narrative from some parties out there, which is that local government spends too much money, it wastes too much money, it needs to spend it better. You need to get rid of all these people that are earning, in their view, vast amounts of money in public services. It's not actually the case, but that will actually fit into their argument. And we talked about it a few weeks ago when the Llywedd said, if the budget doesn't pass, we may not be able to pay people. I think that actually reform-minded voters would say, great, fantastic, that's what we want to see.
Yeah, they might say that, and then when their libraries
hard realism
are
will hit them.
closing, their
Yeah.
bins aren't collected.
Quite.
That's
Yeah.
the problem with this, and I think this is about grown-up politics and the divisive nonsense, frankly, that we're seeing on the other side of the debate.
Well, Jo, as an antidote to your unbelievable cynicism, I would just say that Darren Miller did tweet that he's written in good faith to Labour's First Minister. So
I'm reassured by that,
and
Ollie.
if you believe that, we might have a bridge to sell you. So thank you, Jo, and thank you, Craig. We will be back next week. Press subscribe on your podcast app, and you can find us to watch on YouTube as well. We'll drop into your feeds every week with the latest on Welsh politics and policy making. You will not miss a thing. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk with you again next week.